A very warm welcome to this webinar, which has been organised and hosted by NFER to launch and discuss their 2024 annual Teacher Labour Market in England report. My name is Josh Hillman. I'm the Director of Education at the Nuffield Foundation. We're an independent charitable foundation that funds rigorous research across the domains of education, welfare and justice. We work very closely with all of our grant holders to engage those who can use this evidence to improve educational experiences and outcomes. Now, today's discussion is a great example of that. Looking down the attendee list, I have in front of me, I see a very impressive blend of people from policy, from schools and the teaching profession, and from the research community. And our education work spans all age groups from early years up, and includes wide-ranging analyses of policy, of practice, and the factors that are influencing educational life course journeys across different types of individuals. And research into the teaching workforce clearly brings those three perspectives together: policy, practice, and individual life course, because the quality of teaching experienced by children and young people makes a substantial difference to their educational outcomes, their future employability, and their life chances more broadly. And I should say that's why our second strategic fund, that's a much larger education project, NFER had the first for their Skills Imperative 2035 project, but the second, which we've given to a consortium of researchers that's led by the National Institute of Teaching, aims to further our understanding of teacher quality and teaching quality and identify how teacher training, classroom techniques, professional development all impact pupil outcomes and what might be done to help improve those. And we hope that that project and many of the other projects that we're funding that focus on classroom practice will play a part in improving the capacity of and support for the teaching profession. For example, by using better teaching resources, effective interventions, teachers learning from each other and from outstanding practitioners. We're also kickstarting some work looking at the potential role of various forms of AI to support teachers in their effectiveness and in their use of time, which may be relevant tangentially today. But in the end, our capacity to improve teaching quality will always be limited by underlying recruitment and retention, and associated issues of career development and workload and other working conditions. Now, those challenges aren't new, but in the context and the patterns of the current system, those are shifting constantly, which is why it's important that evidence is up to date, that research continues to explore these factors, and that we're continually debating, as we will this morning, how always limited resources are used in the most effective way. And that's why for several years we funded NFER to undertake a vast array of analyses using a range of administrative data sets, gathering new data to gain deeper understanding of the dynamics within the teaching workforce. Each year they produce an annual report, of which this is now, I think, the sixth, and various other associated outputs, which bring their findings to bear on debates about all aspects of teacher supply. Now, this year we fed into the agenda through an event that we hosted here in our offices last June, which brought together our grant holders and others, some of whom are on this call, I see. And the report addresses some of the key evidence gaps that were identified at that event, including the impact of the ITT market review, changes in career aspirations, some of the non-pecuniary conditions of work, such as bureaucracy and workload, and the ever-increasing role of teachers in the wider lives of their pupils and students. So today, Jack Worth, who's the school workforce lead at NFER, he's going to present the key insights from the research as soon as I shut up. And as a funder, I just want to thank Jack and his many colleagues at NFER who've been involved in the production of this report. It's important, it's distinctive and timely, and it's building the evidence base, and it's already getting good pickup in the media, which is good to see, because that's how we reach the wider public. We then have two education experts who are going to reflect on the research findings and give their thoughts on what the next steps are for policymakers and school leaders. I'm going to introduce their names now, and they are Melanie Renowden, who's the CEO of the aforementioned National Institute of Teaching, and Darren Northcott, who's from the NASUWT, and is also a member of the DfE's Workload Taskforce, so he'll be bringing a very strong professional and policy perspective on the findings. After that, I'll field a Q&A for the three speakers, and you can pose those throughout the webinar using the Q&A function, which you should have in front of you. Please keep these questions as short as you can to help us get through as many as possible and help me manage all of them. I should say the event's being recorded and will be made available afterwards on the NFER website, along with key messages. I'm going to now hand over to Jack to present the findings, and then I would suggest we then, rather than me come back, we'll go straight into Melanie and then Darren responding, and then I'll come back and field the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Josh. Yeah, thank you very much for chairing today's webinar. I'm just going to get my slides up. And also thanks to the Nuffield Foundation for supporting this report and the wider research report, research project that we're just getting underway, which we're aiming to look at the issues affecting teacher recruitment and retention in England and continue to build the evidence base for that and to think about the policy solutions that will be needed. So hopefully you can see that is up on the screen now, which, yeah, I think it is. So yeah, and also thanks very much to my NFER colleagues for NFER who've helped put this research report together. Lots of people involved, but especially to lead author Dawson McLean, who's written the report and put together all of the wonderful charts that we're sharing with you today. So NFER is an independent research organisation. We have a mission to improve outcomes for future generations everywhere and to support positive change across education systems. So we believe that the debate about public policy is always enhanced by independent analysis and insights from robust research evidence. And never is this more needed than during times of dispute and debate, such as during last year's teacher strike action. So we aim to provide views that can be trusted and describe the full picture because they're supported by the data and the evidence. So as Josh said, this is our 6th annual report on the teacher labour market in England, which we've published every year since the DfE published its recruitment and retention strategy. So the series is aiming to monitor the progress that the school system is making towards meeting the teacher supply challenge. But unfortunately, despite the pandemic providing some relief, the challenges after the pandemic leave teacher supply in England in a pretty critical state. So there's a squeeze on teacher supply, which means not enough teachers on the job market to meet the requirements driven by pupil numbers increasing in secondary and replacing those teachers who leave every year. So this leads to shortfalls and shortages, which can be mitigated. School leaders do their best to mitigate these, but by, for example, expensive supply teachers eating into school budgets, or by deploying non-specialist teachers to teach some shortage subjects, which all has a knock-on impact for the quality of the education that pupils experience. And we know from the research that the greatest impacts of that will be on schools serving the most disadvantaged communities. So this really is an issue about the education system, but also about social mobility. So there have been pockets of progress on recruitment and retention, but in general, the situation is that there are key metrics way behind where they need to be, which represents a substantial risk for the quality of education into the future. So the need for policy action to improve the attractiveness of the teaching profession has never been greater. So to understand where we are and where we're heading, we need to understand the trends in recruitment and retention, of course, but we also need insights on the underlying drivers of today's and tomorrow's trends in recruitment and retention. and how those things are affecting the overall attractiveness of teaching relative to other jobs and careers, and how that's changing over time. So that's what we focus on in this report, and today I'm going to do exactly that in this presentation. So look at recruitment and retention and where we're up to and where we've been heading, but also cover the key trends in 3 key areas. So teacher workload, teachers' pay, and also thinking about flexibility. So the supply challenge today is greatest in secondary, where just half of the required number of teachers were recruited into postgraduate initial teacher training last year, despite a slight increase from the previous year. But recruitment levels remain still below where they were just before the pandemic. So also part of that picture is the target increased by 26% overall last year due to a range of things: increase in pupil numbers, more teachers expecting to leave, and accumulating under recruitment in some key subjects. So primary recruitment was lower than the previous year, but was helped out partially by a falling target due primarily to falling pupil numbers. So we also produce a forecast of ITT recruitment for next year. We're still in the middle of the cycle, and that data will report officially in December. So this is data based on applications received so far for initial teacher training starting in September, and also the targets that were published last week. So on the whole, recruitment is improved on last year, but after last year's figures showed that only 3 secondary subjects exceeded their target, this year's data is looking somewhat similar, with 10 out of 17 very likely to be below target, and only 4 subjects with any significant likelihood of being above target. So primary is reasonably likely to be below target. So recruitment numbers are projected to be 36% lower than they were just before the pandemic, based on the applications so far. But then the target has been lower, but the new targets that were published for this year are actually slightly higher for primary compared to last year. So some issues developing in terms of primary recruitment, as well as the well-known issues in terms of secondary. So the slight increase in ITT recruitment in some subjects at secondary level this year has generally been down to 2 things. So first, some bursaries increased in generosity, while other subjects don't have a bursary or were left unchanged. So recruitment in that unchanged group have increased by just 3% compared to the previous year, while those with a bursary have increased by much more. So last year, we published an evaluation of bursaries, which was supported by the Gatsby Foundation. And in that, we found evidence that bursaries are effective generally at increasing recruitment, but also crucially that they have a sustained impact on the number of teachers who are retained in teaching long term. It's also found evidence that they're quite cost effective relative to alternatives like pay or early career payments, pound for pound in terms of it increasing the number of teachers in the profession, but also that they provide disproportionate impact to schools serving the most disadvantaged communities, which is really important. So the other factor is international recruitment. So policy changes to physics and languages last year, such as the £10,000 international relocation payment and making non-UK nationals being eligible for bursaries, have led to more interest in entering teacher training. But as this chart shows, there was a big increase in interest, a big increase in applications, but there was also a high level of those applications being rejected, and also a low level of conversion from acceptances into enrolments. So we therefore have to be really cautious about interpreting the big increases we're seeing in applications this year about what it might imply for recruitment further down the line. But also we need to be additionally cautious about the potential impact it might have on longer term supply until we know more about how these different groups proceed into the teaching profession. But the data does suggest that the policies have led to a boost in recruitment, especially in physics last year. So on retention, last year's retention rates reverted to the levels they were at just before the pandemic. So leaving rates dropped considerably during the pandemic as teachers tended to put off decisions to leave due to uncertainty in the wider labour market. And rising leaving rates last year could reflect some of these delayed decisions being taken then during the post-pandemic recovery. And indeed, the DFE, when setting its ITT targets, assumed that retention rates would improve slightly over time. But we also know from the DFE's Working Lives of Teachers and Leaders survey, which was published recently, that the proportion of teachers who are considering leaving last year was 44% higher than the previous year. So, so it's important to be cautious again in terms of interpreting this, because an individual teacher's stated intention to leave is far from a perfect predictor of them actually doing so. But the trends may well be linked, so it could be a useful leading indicator of what's likely to happen in the next official data that we get on teacher retention in the summer. So we're planning to do some more research later this year as part of this research project to understand whether it is a useful leading indicator. But the data certainly suggests that leaving rates may in fact have risen in 2023, which could be exacerbating these teacher supply pressures on schools when there's such a challenging recruitment environment. So why might leaving rates be rising? So the number one reason why teachers give for leaving is workload. And of course, workload is complex and multifaceted, encompassing how a job feels and how pressures and stresses arise and how they're managed. It's not just about the number of hours worked, but this is a useful starting point for measuring workload, and also is likely to be linked because any additional demands are likely to feed through into additional time spent on the job. So data that we've been analysing from the Labour Force survey, and also backed up by data from the Working Lives survey, shows that teachers' working hours significantly increased in the previous academic year compared to the year before that. So this is also supported by other data showing that there have been increases in other workload-related indicators, such as teacher job satisfaction and workload perceptions. So there seems to be clear evidence of an increase in teacher workload pressures since the pandemic. So workload, sorry about that, workload reduction has been a policy priority for government, and its workload reduction task force is currently developing recommendations to take that work further. Reducing workload relating to marking, planning, administration, and data have been the focus of previous workload reduction efforts. But according to a practice review that was carried out by my NFER colleagues last year for the Education Endowment Foundation, teachers are now saying that pupil behaviour is driving higher workload, and that pupil behaviour management and pastoral care should be a key priority area for workload reduction. So data from the Working Lives survey again backs up this picture, with fewer teachers reporting that behaviour in their school is good, and more teachers saying they spend too much time on behaviour incident follow-up, and that's now higher as a factor than data, planning and marking. But teachers also told us that more support from outside agencies for specific pupil needs, such as special educational needs and mental health and safeguarding, are key to that further workload reduction. So we think that the government should set up an independent review, focusing on how to reduce teachers' workload related to behaviour management and pastoral care, which should consider the role of external support services as well as thinking about schools and teachers. So on pay, the 6.5% pay increase for teachers last year kept pay at pace with the growth in outside earnings, but it didn't do anything to substantially reverse any of the long-term deterioration in teachers' pay competitiveness since 2010. So in real terms, experienced teacher pay is now 11.5% lower in real terms, and 15 percentage points lower than the growth in average earnings since 2010. So starting salaries have fared a bit better, because they've been increased at an accelerated rate to reach £30,000 outside of London, but have also lagged behind wider earnings growth over time. So the gap between teacher pay growth and outside earnings growth also grew during the pandemic, or from before the pandemic to now. But there are also been significant changes to the minimum wage, which have fed into average earnings growth, but are perhaps less relevant as a benchmark for understanding teachers' comparative pay. So this year, we also looked at teachers' pay position within the income distribution of England, using a data set called the Annual Survey of Hours and Earnings. But this shows a pretty similar picture of deteriorating competitiveness since 2010. So experienced teachers, the most experienced classroom teachers, used to earn more than 3/4 of workers, but now that's close to 2/3. So given this picture, and in the context of increasing recruitment and retention challenges, the bare minimum for a pay rise for teachers would be, I think, a funded 3.1% rise. So 3.1% is how much the Office for Budget Responsibility is expecting average earnings to rise by next fiscal year. So anything less than that risks making recruitment and retention more challenging, with everything else equal. But also we need to be thinking about longer term. And ahead of the general election, the political parties really need to develop long-term strategic plans for teacher pay, and for ensuring schools have enough funds to pay for it, to think about that at the next spending review. So finally, on flexibility. So on flexibility, the Working Lives survey shows there has been a promising increase in flexible working opportunities, especially ones that aren't part-time working. So we did an evidence review of flexible working for the EEF last year, which suggests that these kind of flexibilities, so things like working PPA time at home, late starts or early finishes, these are the things are likely to improve teacher well-being and job satisfaction, while also not reducing full-time equivalent teaching hours. But despite this picture of increasing flexibility, there's a bigger picture on flexible working, which is that the wider graduate labour market was completely transformed during the pandemic to offer remote working and hybrid working in huge numbers of jobs. So our analysis of the labour force survey shows the proportion of similar graduates mainly working from home has risen from 16% before the pandemic to 46% now. So there has been an improvement in flexibility in some areas that teaching can offer, which is a really positive step. But teaching just can't compete directly with a change like this externally, that's when it's by its very nature is a frontline profession. So just like police officers, doctors, other NHS workers, it's important to be realistic about the limits of flexibility that within teaching. So providing compensation to frontline public service workers, such as teachers, is one possible option for preventing this inherent inflexibility from undermining the attractiveness of their jobs. So we looked at data from a global survey of working arrangements, which is run by a British economist based in the United States. And that survey shows that UK graduates, who are similar in lots of ways to teachers, value remote working, the opportunity to work remotely, as equivalent to 6.2% of their salary. So given the increase in prevalence of remote working we've seen since the pandemic, we estimate that a 2%, roughly 2% pay uplift in pay, which is, by the way, over and above what I've just been talking about in terms of 3.1% and what's necessary to keep year-to-year rises to keeping pace with outside earnings growth. That's what would be needed to maintain competitiveness with other graduates, taking us back to kind of pre-pandemic levels. So so we think some kind of premium to compensate for that would be a welcome thing, to compensate for the flexibility that the teaching won't be able to offer. So in summary, there have been some pockets of progress, but overall teacher recruitment and retention crisis shows really no signs of abating significantly. The same major issues of recruitment, retention, workload, and pay are still there, and they still persist. So as we gear up for another teacher pay round, a recruitment and retention strategy refresh, and a general election, then these are our key recommendations. So first, we think we should set up an independent review to focus on behaviour management and pastoral care as a workload issue facing teachers, which should encompass the roles of schools, teachers, but also crucially those outside support agencies that give the extra capacity for schools and teachers to deal with these issues. So second, set pay this year to be at least keeping pace with the wider economy, if not higher, to improve the competitiveness and support of recruitment and retention, but also make sure schools have the funds to deliver that without having to make cuts. And then longer term, we need to see some strategic plans on pay that reverse some of the deterioration in competitiveness that we've seen over the last decade or more, with, again, schools given the funds to enact the pay changes without making any cuts. And finally, we need to address other threats to the competitiveness of teaching that have arisen over time, such as the rise of remote working among competing graduate jobs. So, for example, a frontline workers premium could compensate for this change in pay terms using the equivalent value, which we estimate as needing to be around 1.8% for teachers. So, unfortunately, the data and trends we've presented here show a fairly bleak picture, but one that really confirms that we do need some really urgent actions that are ambitious, maybe even radical, but also need to be cost effective to address these challenges. So we need to really make teaching an attractive profession to ensure that schools and pupils have the high quality teachers that they need to support the strength of the country's future economy and the future of our society. So that's our overview. And I think I'm going to hand straight over to Melanie.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jack. So much to dig into, so much to respond to. So I'm going to try and stick to the headlines to stay within my allotted time, but I'm sure we can get into lots more of it in the Q&A. Well, first of all, just to say really welcome the report from the NFER, and that it just does a really valuable job, I think, of joining up the teacher workforce, thinking about both retention and recruitment. And I think really it is too often actually in our thinking that these parts of the story get separated, and actually often our attention gets drawn to focus on recruitment. And I think bringing it all together just is really vital, because recruitment, certainly in a world in which there is either static or a shrinking pupil population, it is principally a function of retention. And also it's really important that we think about it holistically, because otherwise we really miss, I think, risk missing the importance of the development of teacher expertise and therefore impact over time. And it's just pretty reductive to be thinking about this as a sort of one out, one in kind of equation process. So I am trying to flip the way that I'm just even speaking about this, and moving away from talking about recruitment and retention to deliberately changing that to be about retention and recruitment. And that is what I would like to see actually the DfE sort of next iteration of the recruitment and retention strategy to be actually the retention and recruitment strategy as well. So I'm trying to change my habit on that, and maybe like to try and join me. Also at the National Institute of Teaching, we are doing some more work. Josh referred to it right at the start there, looking at that development of teacher expertise and impact over time by building a teacher education data set. And so that's so we can better understand the relationship between teacher development inputs in terms of teacher preparation and CPD as well, and the impact for children as well. So we hope to be able to contribute from the National Institute to our understanding of that too. It's clearly really important that we're very vigorously advocating for the best paying conditions and career offer for teachers, and the critically important to society in the way that you set out at the start role that we all know that teachers play. as well as, I think, celebrating about what's good about teaching profession, so that we're recognising, celebrating the great work that's happening, boosting the status and esteem of the profession, and helping us with retaining and attracting as well. So I think when we are analysing teachers' working lives, and we're doing that job, as you've done great work on within the report, of comparing pay and conditions to what's happening in other graduate professions, I think including important differentiators like school holidays, like teacher pension, actually helps us to better analyse strengths and weaknesses relative to other options that graduates and career changers might have, and potentially think more creatively about ways in which we could improve the competitiveness of teaching against other professions as well. So, for example, is the balance, the kind of ratio between pay and pensions in the early years of teaching set at an optimum level when we're thinking about it in comparison to other professions? And, you know, would it help us if we were examining the ways that other professions talk about their ways of working as being about sort of 6-week cycles followed by 2-week cool-off periods, as an example? So I'm interested to include those differentiators of the teaching profession in our analysis here to help us do a better job of building the very best and most competitive package for teachers, and to boost the status of the profession overall as well. The other thing I'd say about the headline data in the report is that it probably is masking some areas, some parts of the school system. So, for example, special schools, some parts of the country. We know of those, I'm sure lots on the webinar do, where primary recruitment, ITE and staffing remains really challenging. So when we are thinking about our response to what you've set out in the report, I just think it's really important that we're sensitive to those variances, and that we take them into account in our response as well. It would also be really good, wouldn't it, to see the data catch up with the evolution of the academy system, because I think the lack of intel that we have on trust roles probably does obscure some of what's happening in the workforce as well. I would, you set out your recommendations at the end there, Jack, and I would take your recommendation 3, and I would propose extending it from that focus on pay and encompass a full long-term workforce plan. And I think if we say it's needed and we think it can be achieved in the NHS, then given what you've just set out for us in terms of the level of the challenge here, why are we not also calling for that long-term workforce plan in teaching? I think that would really help. That would really help us to be thinking about if we have a sort of longer term view on things like ITE bursaries, the kind of, you know, annual setting cycle prevents long-term planning on attraction there. It would help with thinking about professional development funding. It would help when it came to thinking about you know, timely pay settlements, of course, would help as well. So it would all help the sector and our school employers to plan and deliver with greater confidence, and I think help us grow the overall workforce picture as well. It would also mean we could do a better job of tracking the actual impact of some of the interventions that you've highlighted in the report. So things like international recruitment, ultimately, of course, it sort of only really matters for us if those new recruits coming from overseas and into ITE in slightly greater numbers ultimately go on to thrive in and ideally to stay in teaching jobs in English state schools. So thinking about this on a longer time horizon would, I think, help us to do a better job at that. Just quickly on flexibility, I wanted to respond to some of what you've said there. I think it's important that we are recognising what might be different needs and demands from different sections, tiers of the workforce here. And it was interesting to note in the data included in the report about sort of slightly different responses from teachers with and without children, for example. One key, which is an organisation working in the HE space, had a report out last week about the crisis of loneliness in amongst HE students and its really corrosive effect on well-being, on mental health, and also ultimately on academic outcomes as well. Undergraduate students are calling at great volume for more time on campus, more in-person teaching time, personal tutoring, peer support. And whilst the new graduates are not the only section that are entering teaching as through ITE and in as early career teachers. Of course, they make up a sizable segment of those who are welcoming into the profession. And schools are brilliant at those things. Our offer for new teachers can really respond to some of the things that we're hearing from higher education undergraduate students that they are struggling with and demanding. And it also made me think about what you were flagging in the report as being the sort of more muted leaving rates amongst ECTs, and whether that perhaps might be one of the things that's at play there. A final note just then on leadership development, because there clearly are very major factors that are affecting teacher workload and working experiences that are external to schools, but which need urgent attention. But some factors are within the control of schools. And so if we're going to be responding to those changes in the wider workforce, so in terms of what you've highlighted in the report in relation to behaviour, pastoral leadership and so on, then we are going to need new leadership knowledge and skills. And so there's a question of how we are all collectively supporting school leaders to develop the leadership knowledge and skills that's going to support them with an emerging evidence base of what works in terms of interventions in that area, on workforce, on some of these sort of opportunities around workforce planning, leadership, behaviour and pastoral care in a changing world. It can't be frozen in time, and we do need to evolve it to respond to the picture that we're facing. I'll leave it there for now, but thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute.
Well, thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Josh, and everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm just going to make a few remarks on report, just by way of introduction. Darren Northcott from the NASUWT Teaching Union. We represent approaching 300,000 teachers and school leaders across the UK. And I always think that's interesting because we've got challenges in respect to, and I'll follow Melanie's lead, retention and recruitment across the UK. They're quite similar in nature, very different policy responses. So it's sometimes interesting to compare what's happening across the UK and of course internationally. But I'll just focus my remarks this morning on the situation in England. And I'd also like to start by just congratulating Jack and the team at this year's report. The reports are always important contributors to the debate on teaching. They're authoritative, they're credible, and they're always a means by which my organisation certainly tests and considers its own thinking, and sometimes we even change our mind on the basis of what's set out in so that's all to the good. But I'll just start, I think, where Jack started, and this year's report certainly highlights the extremely precarious nature of the current teacher supply situation in England. And I think it is worth noting, and some of the data that Jack shared underlines that has been the situation for quite some time. And we're still, I'm afraid, fundamentally in a position where too few graduates are considering teaching as a career. And too many of those who are in the profession are actively considering leaving it. And I note Jack's point about the extent to which that's a valid and reliable indicator of eventual decision making. But it's very high, and it's increased pretty substantially in the past 12 months or so. And many of those who are in the profession still feel demoralised, and they feel burned out. And it's important and imperative, of course, that governments address that situation, because as Jack said, we can't achieve our ambitions for children and young people. We don't have adequate teacher supply. We don't have teachers with the support that they need in order to do the best that they can by the children and young people that we teach. And I think one of the things that we probably need to remember is that many of the drivers, and those drivers of retention and recruitment position that we're in, are pretty well established. For some time, we've known what the key drivers are. We know that those drivers can vary according to the experience of the teacher concerned, where they are in terms of their pay progression, subject they teach, where they're in the country. But the kind of big overarching themes, I think, have been well established for some time, and Jack touched on those. So we know that excessive and unnecessary workload is a significant issue. That, of course, undermines teachers' right and entitlement to a work-life balance, but it also means that very often teachers are spending time on tasks and activities that don't really make a difference to the educational progress and achievement of children, and that is a concern. We know that pay, Jack talked a long time very clearly about pay and the impact of pay, its increasingly uncompetitive nature, but also pay and career progression, I think, is something that we would identify as a particularly important issue. Many teachers lack access to those resources, those opportunities that would allow them to advance their careers. Jack's points on pupil behaviour, I think, were very well made, and I think that's been an increasing area of focus, certainly the last 12 to 20 months. The workload implications of managing behaviour are really significant. That's certainly the feedback that we have from our members. Some colleagues on the call may remember the 2018 report, Making Data Work, that had some recommendations about streamlining behaviour management processes in schools. Not all of those have been taken up, but that is a big issue. And behaviour in and of itself is a contributor to teachers' propensity to consider leaving the profession. Really, really important. Other issues as well, maybe we'll get into these in the Q&A, but the point about hybrid working and the value that's attached to that, I think, is very important. Melanie's point as well around the unique circumstances and environment of school are also important, I think, for us to consider. But that fundamental point that graduates have choices, and one of the choices they have is to work remotely or have hybrid working arrangements, and the fact that graduates place value on that is something we need to think about very carefully, and also recommendation in the to look at how pay might be used to some extent to compensate for that. Another factor that certainly is raised with us, particularly by teachers at the start of their career, is we have to think about the extent to which teaching offers those features of a working life, that way, that graduates value most highly. So the chance, for example, to exercise genuine professional discretion and expertise, to use the skills, knowledge and talents you have in order to best meet the needs of the pupils that you teach. Working in relatively non-hierarchical environments is something, again, that graduates say they think is important, it's attractive. You need to think about, is that how schools always are? I'm not sure that that is the case. And also, maybe to touch on something Melanie said, the collegiality of teaching is something that is valued especially highly. So they're all really, I think, well-established drivers of recruitment retention challenges, and some might be solved relatively quickly. So, for example, if your school is asking to see daily and weekly lesson plans 8 years after the teacher workload review recommended and the DFE accepted that shouldn't be happening, stop doing that tomorrow, and it would make a very big difference to working lives of teachers and leaders. But some of the things that Jack talked about are more challenging, they are more demanding, and they will require more complex solutions. I would second Melanie's point about broadening perhaps your recommendation, Jack, in respect of a plan for pay, and I think I would broaden that out to a plan for the workforce, because all of these different factors, workload, pay, recruitment, retention, flexibility, they're all part of a piece. They all interlink with each other. I think we do need something that comprehensive. Melanie mentioned the NHS workforce plan. I know that is not universally popular with everyone who works in the NHS. I recognise that, but at least there is a plan. At least there's a starting point to critique. We don't have that in the education system. Just my final point, we're obviously thinking a lot about teachers and obviously leaders as well. That's important. As someone from the NSWT, you'd expect me to spend a great deal of time focusing on that. But if we are thinking about the workforce in future and we are thinking about a strategy, I really would like to make a case for thinking about the wider school workforce, particularly those working with children as part of that wider school workforce. But all of that wider school is indispensable to the success of the education system. And one of the, I think, most regrettable characteristic features of policy in respect of education over the past decade and a half has been, if you like, the relegation of that issue way down the list of priorities. So we don't have conversations about the support staff of the kind we have about teachers and leaders. So I would like to see a comprehensive work strategy, and that comprehensiveness would encompass not just teachers and leaders, but also others that are vital to the success of our school. Just to say thank you ever so much for the really interesting. We'll be reading it closely and we'll be reflecting very carefully on its findings. Stop there, Josh.
Thank you so much. I mean, Jack, that was a brilliant and crisp summary of what is an absolute sea of analysis, which has been shared with participants here, and we're all going to be disseminating this report widely. And I recommend you swim deeply into it because there's a lot that obviously Jack wasn't able to cover in his presentation. And thank you so much, both Melanie and Darren, for really incredibly thoughtful and constructive responses. It's really good to have a kind of glass half full approach to some of these issues and a more strategic thinking, linking issues, all the issues relating to the teaching workforce. Questions are starting to come in. I encourage participants to keep them coming in. I'm going to combine a couple for the first, which are really mainly directed at you, Jack, but please, Melanie and Darren, come in if you feel like there's additional points to make. And can I just say, Darren, you're going to need to speak up slightly more. Your sound level's a bit low. It was fine. You were audible, but lean in a bit maybe, and you know, put your teacher voice on again.
I've done the high-tech thing of moving my laptop closer to my face.
Exactly, all those sorts of things.
That will do the trick.
So Jack, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. One actually comes from Ben Barton, but it's really about breaking down the retention figures and looking at them by age profile of teachers, and also thinking about school type, so large MATs versus small MATs versus local authorities. Do these sorts of factors show differences within on retention within the wider population of teachers?
Yeah, it's really important to understand this nuance within the data. We do a lot to kind of dig into the data when we produce these kind of high level pictures of what's going on. We kind of don't get quite down into the kind of which age group is up this down the other. But I mean, some questions, really detailed questions that we try to pull out in our analysis throughout the year. There's a question about kind of where are the international applicants applying to within the system, which is an important question, and actually not something we know about from the data that's published, but DFE have started this year to publish much more fine-grained data on ITT applications, which is giving us much greater resolution about this question of which different countries, which different areas of the world teachers are applying from. So I think there's more data becoming available to look at these things. In terms of retention, so we've seen so the age groups kind of the retention tends to follow an experience curve. So early career teachers particularly likely to drop out, mid-career teachers less likely to drop out in terms of their age profile. But again, we're interested in doing more work on the age profile, and also on the age profile of trainees. We've seen an increase in older age groups coming into teacher training, and partly this is because those kind of groups, those kind of career changes, are more responsive to changes in bursaries. So that's one of the effects that we've seen coming through, is that actually it's changing the age profile of trainees, these changes to bursaries. Final point is we've also looked at we've also been developing, and we're going to continue to develop, a data dashboard looking at recruitment and retention by geography, by subject, and by school type, which Nuffield is again supporting us to update. So very soon we'll have the latest data on that from the latest available data.
Thanks very much. I don't know if Darren or Melanie want to add anything to that, but I have another question to bring in if you want to just pick them up afterwards. Okay, so the point the next question I've got really is about, I'm going to direct this at you, Darren, and Melanie, which is about the impact of wider government policy initiatives coming fast and furious, the role of Ofsted, all contributing to concerns for teachers and certainly impacting on retention. I wonder what your views are on central government involvement in education and whether that should be reduced or played out differently.
I'm happy to start. I think the central government has a really important role to play in creating the framework within which our education system operates. I think sometimes that's forgotten, and certainly I think that's been the experience in the past. The government does have an important role to play. Ultimately, it's a responsibility of the state to ensure that children receive the education entitlements that they have, and that does sometimes involve striking the balance. What you can't have, obviously, is an overly centralized system, but you've got to strike the balance between appropriate local level flexibility operating within a national framework. So I and I think the NFER and Melanie as well were talking about having a national workforce strategy for the education system. That's something that has to start with government. So I think we would look for government to exercise that strategic and then providing the flexibility within that for teachers and institutions to meet their local needs. But the government role is absolutely critical to ensuring that we don't get unacceptable variations in practice between different parts of the country, that wherever a child happens to live, in Cornwall or Cumbria or wherever it is, that they're going to get a basic minimum entitlement to education. So government really important, but making sure that whatever national framework we have, there's sufficient local flexibility, yes, to meet local needs and local imperatives.
And then I would add to that also the role of employers. So alongside what Darren is describing, which I would agree with, it is also the role of those that are employing teachers here. And so thinking about the role at school level, obviously local authority, and then also the trust system, and having confident employers who are able to sort of draw on evidence in order to evolve their workforce practices so that they are doing that kind of long-term talent management, workforce planning to create a really compelling career offer that supports and develops teachers and leaders in the long term is a space that we need education employers to be occupying. And it was one thing I was thinking about actually reading the report and seeing those sort of very early evidence examples of sort of promise, sort of experimentation in thinking about flexible working, that there clearly are some employers who are doing some quite interesting work here. And I was seeing recently Dixon's Academy Trust that's doing some sort of thinking about the potential of 9-day teaching fortnights, and AET Trust also looking at their workforce planning and sort of talent progression, and doing that in quite an open source way. So sharing it with the system, saying here's the sort of challenge that we're trying to respond to, here's our thinking about the ways in which we can tackle it, and we're going to just talk to everybody about that so we can all collectively learn more and get better. So there's an important role there also for employers, and then implications, of course, in terms of sort of leadership, knowledge and capability that comes with stepping into that space.
Thanks very much. I'm going to pick up the pace a bit because we've got some really good questions coming in. I'm just returning to the international recruitment. I guess this is more for you, Jack. A couple of really interesting questions on that. One from Paul Usher, who's asking about whether his assumption is that this is mainly towards large cities and towns and may not be helping to support recruitment troubles in sort of rural and coastal areas. So and then while you're answering that, could you also say a little bit more about the international recruitment of teachers in relation to the new IQTS holders?
Yeah, they're both really interesting questions, and I'm not sure I've got answers to them in terms of what impact the IQTS is having on this, and more generally, kind of where these international teachers are applying to. I think it would be really interesting data to look into, I think it's important to say the Department for Education is very good at making data available for researchers such as us at NFER. So these are exactly the kind of questions that we can dig into the data and start to explore. So yeah, well done DFE for making lots of data available and enabling us to answer these questions. I haven't got an answer to them at the moment, but yes, they are important questions nonetheless.
And as a research funder, always interested to hear new research questions. Let's turn to teaching assistants and support staff, which we haven't really touched on much. Jack, what does the data show on the relative significance of the recruitment and retention crisis of teaching assistants as compared to teachers? Hannah Harris has suggested that 1 in 5 TA roles are currently unfilled. I don't know if that's something you want to add to?
Yeah, so it's certainly a workforce we know a bit less about because there's kind of less data available about this workforce, but it doesn't diminish the importance of this workforce, as Darren was saying, in terms of how the school and education system operates. It's critical to it. But data we do have does seem to be suggesting that. So my NFER colleagues did a research report on the cost of living crisis, which is supported by the Nuffield Foundation last year. And that came very strongly through that the increases in the minimum wage and opportunities to work in other industries and more flexibly in other industries was putting a real pressure on the supply of teaching assistants and support staff. And I've seen it as a school governor in the local school is kind of, that's where the real pinch is finding those support staff to support the school. So it's certainly an issue, but certainly an issue where we need more research and more data to understand it more and understand how it's evolving and developing.
Melanie, or is there anything you want to add about teaching assistants, or Darren?
I was going to add something about international teachers, just
Go on.
back a question. I think what Jack says is right. And the DFE, I think, do get the important contribution teachers from beyond the UK can make to teacher supply in this country, absolutely. And they've worked very hard to try and stand up a post-Brexit, if you like, model of teacher migration into England. My concern is that elsewhere in Whitehall, some of the messages about how welcome this country is to workers from overseas perhaps aren't all they could be, to put it mildly. So we've seen some of the work that's been undertaken in respect of incentives, but let's not forget, while the threshold for salaries for teachers is set to the bottom of the pay range, those teachers will have to pay an almost 100% increase in the health surcharge. That is a big deterrent, as is the increase in the threshold for the family visa. So there are still barriers to recruitment from elsewhere, from beyond the UK, that I think call for some joined up government, because it's the DFE can work hard to try and improve teacher supply from beyond the UK, but other parts of Whitehall have to do their bit as well to make sure that this is a place where teachers from overseas feel welcome and feel that their contribution will be valued.
I'm going to be cheeky and squeeze in one last question, even though we're really nearly run out of time, because it's such a good one. It comes from Lizzie Croft, and it's about NPQs and whether you think they should be continued to be funded fully, given the sort of resource constraints. What's your sense of what should happen and what is likely to happen in the policy context? Anyone answer that? Any of you three, please.
I'll go first on that, Josh, if you like. So back in 2019, when we were awaiting the launch of the last recruitment and retention strategy, we were having the same conversation about the future funding of NPQs. And I remember it was one of the things that was in that recruitment and retention strategy was the importance of being able to secure long-term funded places for the NPQs. I think sort of 5 years on, here we are again, waiting for a new recruitment and retention strategy and potentially facing some challenges when it comes to sustaining the levels of funding, which have been boosted by education recovery funding in recent years. But given all of the financial pressures that we know are squeezing affordability when it comes to choices that the department and the Treasury are making, I think that's going to be tough. And but it's vitally important that teacher continue professional development to support both the development of expertise and also progression and retention is a core part of our offer to teachers throughout their careers.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now wrap us up. I mean, just to say a couple of things by way of conclusion. Let's just, first of all, just to highlight some of the work that's coming up on this project, which I think a lot of participants in this webinar will be interested in. NFER are going to be doing some detailed analysis of career intentions and the teacher recruitment pipeline, aiming for sort of May, June kind of time. Similarly, a recruitment and retention data dashboard available around the same time. And then over the summer, they're going to be doing work on recruitment challenges connected to the number of new graduates, and then in the autumn, work on influences on teacher retention. So a lot of very detailed work which will supplement what we've just been discussing today, and actually pick up many of the points we've had in an excellent discussion, for which thanks to everybody who's taken part in this, including the wonderful 3 speakers, NFER in general, and really brilliant questions from all the participants. I'm sorry if I wasn't able to pick up every single question, but we're noting them, and we'll maybe find a way of getting back to you on them. But in the meantime, hope everyone has a great rest of their days, and thank you very much for joining us.